there's a narrative or like a mindset frame that I think a lot of people have where it's like pregnant women are fragile. Yeah, there's absolutely an identity shift that then you have to work on shifting back to. So like that's kind of where it started. And so other countries who require pelvic floor rehab after delivery, and then you look at us and it's like so many people don't even know about it, much less it's not required, because it's something that nobody really talks about.
Welcome back, you guys, to another episode of the Beyond the Scale podcast. I'm your host, Mary Katherine. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Katherine, who is a business owner and physical therapist with a specialty in pelvic health. She's the co-owner of Move Athletics, a performance-based physical therapy clinic in West Springfield, Massachusetts, and the Performance Rehab Authority certification, a continuing education course for PTs, which she and her partner kicked off earlier this year. Dr. Katherine's unique ability to blend her experience as an athlete and her strength and conditioning background with her doctorate level training in rehab of injuries and pelvic floor expertise allows her to help her clients in every stage of the rehab and prehab process, from any stage of recovery all the way deep into their training goals. So I am so excited to dive into this conversation with Dr. Katherine today because I am a mom of two little ones. And after having my daughter almost 6 years ago, I actually got into pelvic floor therapy. And it was such a unknown thing for me. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I quickly realized how much I needed it and how much I could benefit from it. And so I am so excited to talk to Dr. Katherine today for you listeners who are out there who maybe you're interested in pelvic floor therapy, or maybe you've never even heard of it. And after this conversation today, you're probably going to be like, okay, I need this. So let's dive right into it. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to teach people about pelvic floor PT. I feel like it's really been only the last few years, like with social media and more, I guess just more attention. It's been able to like grow and escalate, and more people have been able to hear about it. But there's still a lot of, uh, I think there's still a lot of myths around it, or just a lot of like unawareness or mystery around it too.
I agree. And honestly, when I got pregnant with my daughter, I knew what pelvic floor therapy was because my husband is a PT, but I thought only older people have to do that. Only the women who, when they sneeze, they pee their pants. And then, fast forward a year later, after I had my daughter, I was the person peeing my pants when I was sneezing and coughing. And honestly, I kind of thought to myself, how could this be me I was still in my 20s when my daughter was born. I'm like, how could I have this problem in my late 20s? I thought this was only something that older women had. And it was very eye-opening for me. And like, I think many women feel that it's just a part of childbirth and it's a part of being a woman that they just have to deal with. But we don't, because of pelvic floor therapy, we can do something about it. So can we kind of start there with, I guess, first off, how did you get interested in this space? Because this is a very niche thing. And so like, how did you get into it?
Yeah. By nature, I love sports and ortho and exercise. I've always been into fitness. And so when I got licensed and started working, that was my niche, is active adults. And so there's obviously a lot of women who are active adults. And so they would come see me, and then there would be people that I didn't know how to help. There's like there's a narrative or like a mindset frame that I think a lot of people have where it's like pregnant women are fragile. So like that's kind of where it started. And so I would have like a pregnant woman on my schedule who had low back pain. And I was like, I don't know what to do with them. And I was like afraid to touch them as a new grad. And then that trickled into, so like I knew I had questions on that. And then people started coming in with other issues like, oh, well, I have like some heaviness, or I pee a little bit sometimes. And there, even like coming into, I'll say regular PT. So like the orthopedic traditional, like what you think of when you think of physical therapy, people would come in and they're not very forthcoming with that kind of stuff unless you ask for it, because it's something that nobody really talks about. But when you do dig deeper into that kind of stuff, I never knew the answers to those questions. And so at a certain point, one of my patients had actually gotten pelvic floor PT, and this patient was one of my friends at the time. And so I went in and I went and had a pelvic floor session. I was like, "Oh, this is really really neat, and there's so much that we can learn that wasn't covered in PT school. Like they don't teach any of it. This is all post licensure, post getting your doctorate." Um, because they only teach what incontinence is. You don't even really learn all the muscles that are down there, which is insane. So I went through all of that training because I was starting to see more women come in who were postpartum who wanted to get back to exercise, or I had seen women, for example, like maybe who came in with hip pain or back pain, and they also had a lot of chronic pelvic pain. And I had no idea what to do. So I went down that journey of learning how to help people. And now that's my bread and butter, is working with like active women, and so, really, pelvic floor PT is just a subspecialty of orthopedics, because you can't take the pelvic floor and isolate that from the body. Like it's a major part of the body. And when we're looking at how it functions, even when somebody comes in for an evaluation, it's okay. How is your trunk moving? What's your core pressure management like? And so it affects everything that you do. And so like at the performance clinic that we have, and I know I'm like going off on a tangent answering the question, but like when people come in, you might start with, okay, we're going to look at the pelvic floor and look at pelvic health in general and see how all that's functioning. But the way that you progress pelvic health rehab is really then getting into the sports and performance side of it. So it like blended what I loved with something that I thought was like mysterious and didn't understand. And then when
Yeah.
those two come together, it's really cool, because then like there's so many people who are struggling with all of that, and who need help just needing the guide to get from point A to point B, that you can really impact lives.
I love that so much because in the beginning you mentioned like many people wouldn't touch pregnant women, and like I have very much seen that, especially as a gym owner. We'll have women come in here, just an example, like we'll have women come in who have been coming consistently, and then they get pregnant, and they literally like they'll have a meeting with us and they'll say at 8 to 12 weeks, so early on, they'll say, "Oh, my doctor said I need to stop doing this. I need to stop doing boot camp. I need to stop running." All of the things. And I'm like, your doctor said that because your doctor is not educated on how to educate you on what's best for your body right now. And it's really hard as a gym owner because like I am not a doctor. So I'm not licensed to give like, this is really what you should do, but this is my recommendation. And so I love to hear that there are people out like you out there that are like, okay, let's look at your body. Let's see how everything is connected. Another example, when after I had my daughter, this was one of the reasons why I started pelvic floor therapy. So I go to do a box jump a few months postpartum. I should never have been doing that. I knew that my core was not strong as it was prior to, my pregnancy and delivery, but I go to do a box jump and I'm coming back down. And the way I landed, my lower back was just absolutely killing me for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I never even thought it was connected to the pelvic floor. Like I never made that connection until I started going to pelvic floor therapy when another something else happened. But as I'm, being educated on everything, she's like, "Yeah, it's it's all connected. Like everything that you're doing, those deadlifts, the box jumps, all of that is connected." And it was eye-opening. So what are some of like, I guess, the main things, the most common things you see women come to you for, that maybe they are someone in the gym and they're working out and they're like, this hurts? What are the most common things that you're seeing?
Yeah. So um, I kind of put people into two buckets, even though there's like a plethora of things in each bucket. So, like, there's the people who come in for pre pregnancy, pregnancy, and postpartum, which is a lot. And they're all super different.
Yeah.
processes. And then there's also a group of people who come in for like incontinence specifically. And then I think then there's a lot of other people. So I guess there's three buckets. There's like a smaller bucket here of people that happen to be on my schedule because I also see like ortho, and maybe they have back pain or something. And then I start digging into questions, and it's these other things that they've never thought of or that they've always just lived with, like leaking a little bit or losing a little bit of gas, or constipation. And so those are other things that then we start working on. But there's like the main buckets of people come in for the incontinence. Like that's what maybe drives people of it's gotten to be too much. They have to pack the pads, or they have to bring the change of pants, or turn around and go home after the gym because they have to go change or shower before they go do this thing. And then
Yeah.
there's this group of people who are either preparing for a baby or who have just had a baby, and like, and those are what their goals are around, are getting their body ready for pregnancy, ready for delivery, or ready to get back to exercise postpartum. And so uh, those are, I think, a large number of the groupings that people come in for. And then I think even going back to what you were saying before about like people come into the gym and they say that their doctor is basically like instill fear in them to
Yeah.
exercise. Like that's one of the myths that's still around, even in the healthcare industry, because I think a lot of providers, there's a disconnect, right? Like people are concerned with the delivery process and making sure that you survive it and you end up well, but that doesn't equate to like living and functioning, and
Mhm.
exercising, because that's not their wheelhouse. Like they're not the ones focusing on that day in and day out. And so that's a myth of, you can't start a new routine when you're pregnant. You can't increase your activity level when you're pregnant. You absolutely can. And that's like one of the best things that you can do during pregnancy is to stay active and to do all of this, because the better you can put your body in a position for basically that really big athletic event that is childbirth, then the better off you'll be, assuming that there's no complications with delivery. So
Mm.
then, yeah, I mean, going into all of that postpartum, one of the first things that we work on is just trying to get your body to coordinate things again. And especially after having gone through pregnancy and delivery, those muscles. So we look at like the abdominal muscles that stretch out. And then if you're holding a baby, your pelvic floor muscles stretch out and they're holding this load. And so they've slowly been gone through this whole process. And then suddenly after delivery, everything's different for them. They don't know how to coordinate. They're not very strong because they've been under load and stretched for so long. And so, I mean, you have to go through this process. Like you look at other countries who require pelvic floor rehab after delivery, and then you look at us and it's like so many people don't even know about it, much less it's not required. And so that's a big chunk of what I do. When I moved up here, a lot of the friends that I first made when I moved to Massachusetts were because since I was doing pelvic floor, I started making friends with a lot of moms, and I don't have any kids of my own. But I started going to like mom walks and like book club and all that kind of stuff, and it's great. And it's like it also just happened to increase the word about like what pelvic floor PT can do. And so I mean, there's so much from like exercise routines and doing all of that.
Yeah. I love that. And I love how you're like adding that educational piece for women because I do think it's just and also, like, for me, I'll just say this, in the beginning, when I started, like, I'll never forget the first time I went. I actually went to one, pelvic floor therapist, and I didn't like her style of therapy, so I went to another one. It was very different. Um, but it was uncomfortable. You know, it was something that like I was like, I have no idea what to expect here. And I had homework and I remember going home and like, researching all of these things that she's asking me to do on my own. And I'm like, this is really uncomfortable. But it got me thinking about a client in the gym or even like my first time going to a new gym. It's uncomfortable, but the more you do it, the more you strengthen that muscle, no pun intended, and it gets more comfortable and it gets easier and you start to see the benefits. what is something, and I know this would be hard for you to like really show us or explain all of it, but what are some things that women who are pregnant, we'll start there. What are some things women who are pregnant should be doing on their own or at the gym to help strengthen their pelvic floor?
I think it comes down to so like the pelvic floor, but also using it as the whole system. So if we look at the system as a whole, there's three major pieces. So we have the diaphragm that moves up and down when we breathe, and then we have I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah.
And then we also have the transverse abdominis, which goes all the way around. That's your body's natural back brace. That expands and contracts when we breathe. And then we have the pelvic floor muscles, which is that little hammock in your pelvis that
Mhm.
descends and then rises again when we're breathing too. And so all of that's happening naturally. And if you imagine it's this ball that it's expanding and contracting. And so when we're breathing naturally, we generate a little bit of pressure. And then as we're exercising, the pressure increases. So when someone's pregnant and they're looking at, okay, how can I keep this as healthy as possible? How can I maintain strength and coordination and endurance here? A lot of it comes down to like maybe some breathing exercises to make sure that as the muscles expand, we can still maintain that coordination, remind the muscles, so to speak, like where they are in space at that time so that you can uh, have a better ability to contract them and coordinate them after delivery.
Mm.
So doing breathing exercises and then doing a lot of transverse abdominis, like bracing. So that might be getting into a quadruped position just on your hands and knees and pulling in, especially in that third trimester when maybe you don't want to be doing a plank.
Right.
And then there's other things like a modified plank on your knees. There's um, even more functional things like doing a farmer's carry or a suitcase carry where you can just brace. A lot of the pelvic health exercises where we're using the whole system is really just how can we apply these principles of managing pressure, using the coordination and bracing appropriately to a workout or to an exercise. Um,
Mm.
and so it might start off with some core specific exercises like lying on your stomach, um, doing planks or doing that quadruped motion. But it can also be still squatting, focusing on bracing when you're doing an overhead press, because by nature, we like to open our ribs and try to extend, especially when that
Right.
weight gets heavy. And so it's applying those principles and making sure that we're not losing it and that we even to start have the appropriate coordination because a lot of people like pregnant or not they'll come in and I talked about those three different levels. So we have the diaphragm, the transverse abdominis, and then the pelvic floor muscles. People come in and at baseline they have a hard time coordinating just their breathing. And so maybe when they're inhaling their stomach pushes out and then when they're inhaling their stomach comes in and then when they exhale they push it out. And so that's the opposite. When we're inhaling and exhaling, we want those muscles, that ball, to expand and contract. Because then, like if you think about it when you're running or when you get your heart rate up in a really heavy workout, now all your muscles are tightening even more and flexing. And what that's doing is that's condensing all that pressure in your core and creating stability. So
Mm.
that's what we want to be able to do to maintain throughout pregnancy.
Oh, that's interesting. I was just like seeing what I do when I breathe in and out. Like, do I push my stomach out? Do I put it in? I don't know. Now I'm gonna be thinking about it when I'm working out. I really love that you mentioned like the bracing and just like the pressure, because I have the ab separation and I work out every day and I know there's more stuff that I can do, but one of the PTs I worked with did say doing more bracing to bring that in. And I thought to myself, if only I would have done that when I was pregnant, if I would have just focused on that more, maybe it wouldn't have been so bad. How do you coach women postpartum who maybe they didn't do any of that stuff while they were pregnant? Maybe they didn't work out at all, but now they're like, I got this baby out. I want to get in the best shape of my life. And I can barely do a sit up. And it's always surprising to me, I'll just add, that I am a very active person. And many of my friends are like this. Like, we all go to the gym, but then when it's like one of the stations has planks and sit ups, we're like still dying because our core
Yeah.
still isn't very strong. So, is it like the same advice postpartum, just managing or working on that bracing and pulling it in?
Yeah, so you're starting at a different baseline. So after delivery, all of your muscles, it's like a baby learning to walk is the best way to put it. Everything, your muscles have to acclimate to their new position. Right now, they're lengthened out because your body has had a different um, position with the muscles of where they are because they're around the baby to create support. And so now they're learning, okay, how do we contract and then they start acclimating a little bit more. The muscles start shortening, getting back to where they are. It does come down to like a lot of the same core pressure management strategies. You have to make sure that you're breathing the right way, that you're coordinating things. You have to just gently um, pull in. And one of the and I kind of lost my train of thought from the original part of the question I think that you asked. So you might have to remind me on that.
Okay.
But like when we're taking women through that with the diastasis recti, I would also first validate because it's a natural part of the process. Like the abdominal muscles have to separate a little bit during pregnancy in order to make room for the baby to continue growing. And so
Right.
that's a natural part of the process. And then even if you've done nothing throughout pregnancy, as soon as you can or have the opportunity to after delivery, you can start bracing. And the body is so resilient. The pregnancy and delivery is incredible, and that's one of the things that like the resilience of the body that first got me into PT is because it can come back from so much. So when
Yeah.
we're looking at that abdominal separation, using that core bracing muscle, the one that I talked about, the transverse abdominis, is deep to that separation. So if we're looking layer by layer, we have those six pack muscles which have a little
Mhm.
bit of space between them, and then behind that is like this belt. And so as you work on strengthening the belt, it's kind of like as it gets stronger, it's like a corset because it goes all the way around your core. And
Yeah.
that's what can help bring it together and at least functionally brace and pull everything together. Um, does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it does. Now, I have so many questions about this, and I won't get too much into it, but It is it possible to completely correct it with exercise? Because I know, like, I have a friend who recently got, um, the surgery where she surgically had her muscles repaired, and she said, "I've worked on it, and it just won't go back the way it was." And I wonder, is it possible to go back the way it was, or is there at some point where it's like, this is as close as it's gonna get, and surgery would be the only way to correct it?
Yeah. So it depends on the degree. And for, I would say, most people, they can at minimum functionally correct it. So
Mm.
maybe at rest, they can still feel a little bit of separation. But
Yeah.
then when they're exercising and they're bracing, it comes back together and it can support them. And so when it needs to be on, it's on and there's no problem functionally. I think there's a small percentage of people who, they had an extreme separation and you can work on it and strengthen it, but uh, it it's hard to uh, I think bridge that gap completely depending on the severity of it.
Mm, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting because like women when they have babies, they're like, "Oh, my hips have gotten so much wider." Like everything just keeps getting wider. And we actually we fall victim to the pregnancy and everything we went through, and not often enough are we looking in the mirror and saying like, "We have the power to fix this. Like
Yeah.
let's try to fix it." We a lot of times just say like, "It is what it is." And we live with it, but you don't have to live with it.
Yeah, I majority of the time it's and I mean it's really the outliers. It's
Yeah.
majority of the time you can functionally brace and correct it. And even someone who has a significant separation, you can go and do training, and if you're managing your core pressure, which is focusing on all of that pelvic health, you're going to be fine. And you can still do all the things. You just have to know how to maintain your pressure. And so I think that's like one of the big principles when we're looking at like pelvic health.
Yeah. So say we have someone listening to this who they're in their 50s. Maybe they
Mhm.
had kids 20 years ago or more, and they've been dealing with some pelvic floor issues and complications for years, and they've just dealt with it. And they listen to this and they say, you know what? I think I'm going to look into pelvic floor therapy. Is it too late? Is it ever too late?
No, never. There's so much that can be addressed, even 20, 30, 40 years later, because it all comes down to how is the body functioning right now.
Okay.
So it's kind of like looking at a sprained ankle. If I sprained my ankle 20 years ago, but I have ankle pain today, I don't think it's the sprain from 20 years ago that's causing today's ankle pain.
Mhm.
It's something that's happening mechanically that's continuing to stress my ankle. Even though that may have started the waterfall 20 years ago, but there's something that's still contributing to it. So when we look at um, stressors, maybe it's the way that you're breathing, the way that you're managing your pressure, maybe there's some things that are weak. Even looking outside of the pelvic health um, areas, there's, say, when you're squatting, if you have limited mobility in a hip, then you're going to end up using your back a little bit and compensating. You might not be able to maintain your pressure well. And so then you may end up with some back pain, you may end up with some leakage, and then the the only symptom that you see is the back pain or the leakage, not the other thing that you're dealing with. And I think that also leads into another point of the number of times that I've had people come in who have both something going on in the pelvic region to uh, to their back, like there's a back issue. And I know you mentioned this at the very beginning of that you had back pain and you were also having these other things. Those overlap so much because the spine, where all of your nerves are, gives your pelvic floor all the function, all the sensation, all the strength. And so if there's something going on with your back, it can absolutely affect your pelvic floor and vice versa.
Mm, so interesting. Oh, okay. Let's see. So I'm trying to think of like some of this very specific things that women say that they can't do because of their pelvic floor or their lack of mobility down there. I know one. Okay, so many women when they're pregnant and even postpartum say like the doctor said no jumping, no jumping, no running, no high intensity, no high impact. What are your thoughts around high impact, and is that a myth or is there some truth to that?
So it depends on where you are. So, um, are we talking like postpartum 6 week mark, or are we talking about just for symptoms?
I guess just for symptoms.
Okay. No, I think it's all based on a progression. If I pee every time I'm jumping or every time I get on a trampoline,
Right.
um, which is a really common one for people, they're like, oh, I can't get on trampolines because I lose urine. Um, when you work on this, you have to be working at and towing the line with that threshold where you're kind of getting into those symptoms if you're addressing the things that are causing it. It's not that you can't ever jump again, and it's not that you shouldn't jump. You just have to address the things that are causing all of that. So maybe it's a pressure management issue when you're jumping. Maybe you're not breathing the right way. I've had a lot of people who have come in, uh, and that's a symptom that they've had. And maybe we started off working on things that weren't jumping. And so I said, okay, for right now, we're not jumping. But then as the symptoms got better, as the coordination gets better, as the strength gets better, now we're doing, some small hops. Now we're doing light jogs. Then we start getting into some interval runs. And then we get into higher jumps. And we go from like bounding to sprinting and then eventually jumping on the trampoline because it's all variations of impact. And so if I can control how much impact is being absorbed at the pelvic floor, then we just turn it down a little bit and work up to it as we're working on all the other things.
Hmm, that's interesting. And something too I have found is like different movements where like they'll still be, for example, I can do high knees just fine, but what the second I start doing jumping jacks, that's different. And so it's like depending on the movement, like they're both high impact, but I'm moving differently. And I notice that one's harder for me than the other.
Yeah. So when the legs start going in different positions, and people notice this too with like lateral squats or sumo squats,
Yeah.
especially then when they start loading it, when we get into that position where the legs are more splayed, the pelvic floor muscles are in a more lengthened position, which means they're a little bit more vulnerable. And so then if we look at a deep squat position, or consider even just what like a squatty potty does if you sit down,
Yeah.
uh, that's the position that we void in, which is the only time that the pelvic floor truly relaxes. So if that's a position of vulnerability, we have to work harder at that position to build the strength because that's where it's most likely to be weak.
Mm,
So in those instances, what I might do with the um, like jumping jacks, I might regress that to, all right, we're going to work on non-impact, do some lateral lunges, maybe do some tempo work, pauses, breathing, start loading that up with weight. And then from there, we'll get into some of the quicker movements, maybe do some quicker lateral lunges, get into the hops, and then get back into the jumping jacks. Because it's a matter of, before I was talking about like coordination, strength, and endurance, and the muscles have to have those three things. And so I think that's more of an endurance issue and then a force absorption issue on the impact.
yeah. Oh, this is great. How do you think like taking care of your not only like pelvic floor therapy, but say you're dealing with anything in which you're in pain every single day, or when you go to the gym, you're having a hard time doing the movements. How do you feel like therapy in general can not only help your body, but your mental health?
Yeah. We, when a lot of people come into the clinic, that's one of the things, when somebody has an injury, they stop doing the thing that gives them joy. And so then they literally say that they've like lost a piece of themselves. And
Yeah.
a lot of the time when it's ongoing, they start like going through this spiral. So when there is something like that, the I think the normal human thing to do that we all want to do is to stop the thing and to find an alternative.
Mhm.
And that's not always the solution because we tend to become less and less active because then there's also that like psychological component of like, this is what I want to be doing and I can't. And a lot of the times it comes down to knowing something that's called like mechanical stressors. What are the specific movements or movement patterns that are making things worse? And so if I know the stressors, like for example, if it's a load sensitivity, if I bend forward and that causes pain, maybe I'm just doing exercises where I keep my trunk completely upright. So I can still lunge, squat, do step ups, do all of those things, but I'm not necessarily irritating, say it's a spine pain thing,
Yeah.
with all of that. And so people can come in and they can still stay very fit, but it's just about being more intentional and smarter with which exercises that they can still do. Because and I think like that's a big thing on day one when people come in here is we spend so much time on education because we want people to stay active through rehab because that's going to get people back to it quicker. It's
Yeah.
kind of like when I don't know when you get hurt and then you go through that and then you notice like you go through this whole spiral of okay, I'm not as fit as I was. You start eating more junk food and then you have a longer ladder to climb.
Mm. Yeah, I love how you mentioned like people come in and they can no longer do the thing that brings them joy and they think they have to find an alternative because I very much was there. Like after I had my daughter, I ran a half marathon like 6 months postpartum, and I've always been a runner, so like I just thought I could just get out there and just do it, and I did, and I was peeing my pants the whole time. And then when I after that race, that's when I started pelvic floor therapy, and what I was finding is when I was running, I was having the leakage, but also I was having a lot of hip pain. And there was a brief period for about a year where I kind of just stopped running. And I thought to myself, I can't do this like I used to. And now, 5 years later, I run multiple times a week. I don't have any hip pain. I have very little leakage. And it's because I have worked really hard to strengthen my hips, to strengthen my core. I've done the therapy and I have found a good routine in which, as long as I'm continuing my strength training, I can also run at the same time. But the second I stop doing that strength training and I lose that strength, all of that pain comes back, and it's crazy how I've noticed it, and it's crazy how like the human body, it just works like that. But I really love how you mentioned that because we see too many times women walk into the gym and they'll say, I used to be an athlete. I used to be able to do this. I used to go out there and run and do all these things that I loved. And they're using that like dialogue, like I used to, like they no longer can. And it's like, no, you can. We just have to get you back to that point where your body is ready for that and your body is physically conditioned in a way where you're not going to experience that pain.
Yeah. Yeah, there's absolutely an identity shift that then you have to work on shifting back to. And I think your outcome speaks to, it sounds like before the first pelvic floor PT that you went to, because there are different kinds, maybe wasn't focused more on also doing like making you move. And then the second one was focused on, okay, we have to work on all these things, but you also have to do performance based stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I think some of the best pelvic floor exercises are deadlifts, lunges, tempo squats, because you're stressing the pelvic floor. If you're just doing I know there's a lot of people who their experience has been when they go to pelvic floor PT, they're just doing internal work or lying on a table, and
Mhm.
Kegels aren't gonna fix anybody.
Right.
That's like the so if we look at like just standing and squeezing your quads over and over and over again. That doesn't equate to being able to back squat 175 pounds. Like
No.
that's not the same thing. So you're never going to be able to do enough quad squeezes to
Right.
train 175 pounds. And that's the same
Yeah.
thing with like running. You have to be doing the thing. So I think that's fantastic. And even that you like went and advocated for yourself and you're like, yeah, this isn't working. I'm going to I'm going to try this other thing.
Yeah. And it is like I feel like and I'm sure you have so many different techniques and things you've learned over the years. Like there's some parts of pelvic floor therapy that I experienced that were a little uncomfortable when you are lying on a table and you're having that initial evaluation and you're like, what is this? Am I like at the OBGYN again? Like I did not think this is what this was. But then once you get past that and you get to the point where they're like, okay, these are some things I want you to do on your own, and they kind of help you, like for me, and I'm sure you do this with your clients, like I explained to my PT what my workout routine was like, and she would say like, let's do more of this and less of this, and like we would kind of figure it out together. That way I didn't feel like she was saying, don't do anything that you've been doing. I'm going to remove all of the joy, as you mentioned, away from your life, and you're only going to do this now. And so I really appreciate a therapist who can kind of meet you where you're at and help you create a plan that's going to, help your body, but also keep you happy and enjoying what you're doing.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, a lot of pelvic floor PT, especially in the beginning for some people, is really uncomfortable because there's times where I may prescribe somebody to use a pelvic wand and go home and do internal work on themselves. And like, that's not pleasant. And then there's also I think just mental hump that you have to overcome to go home and do internal work. And it is uncomfortable. It can be, um, we keep it like under the threshold of where it's not
Yeah.
painful, but things like that, especially in the beginning as you're getting to be able to start doing more of the movement things, is is kind of funky to have to deal with and go through. um, and then I think too, for the timeline of that you were talking about earlier, like you went and you were able to run a half marathon, but you were having all these symptoms originally. There's this uh, disconnect between providers and pelvic floor PT where there's like a 6 week magic mark where they're like, okay, you can go do exercise. And I
Right.
think that more speaks to tissue healing times, like if there's a tear or that everything has been healed correctly, um, from the tissue perspective. But you can start lifting weights and breathing and squatting and doing non-impact things, provided that you have the coordination and you're working on all of that, really starting day one. Like it's not like you're on bed rest, hopefully, week 2 after delivery. You're like moving a baby around and taking care of it. And so there's going to be things that you can do. And then when you start having more time, getting back into it, slowly getting back to all the movements and then starting to add impact as long as your symptoms are okay with it.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that many women I did this with my first pregnancy. It's almost like you're giving yourself that hall pass to like not do anything right after the baby's born. Like I'm gonna wait till that 6 to 8 week mark when my doctor says it's okay, and then the longer I've been in this industry, the more I'm like, no, don't wait for your doctor to say anything. Like go out there and go for that walk and just do what feels good for your body. Like only you know what feels good. And after I had my son, like I was working out within the first week. I started doing very low impact and a lot of walks. And I was like back to that point where I felt really, really good so much quicker than after my first kid.
Yeah.
So I just, oh, I love that. Like I hate it when people are like, I have to wait till that 6 week appointment. And I'm like, for what?
Yeah. Well, and the thing too is like if we look at the timeline now, there's a baby, life is completely different, especially right after delivery. You're figuring out what role you're filling,
Right.
who you are. Your identity is completely changed. And then for people who have been active and they've been an athlete their whole lives, if they're not doing anything, then there's this, kind of shock that's like, I can't do anything until X point. And so
Yeah.
it's like, no, keep moving. I've had people come in, I think like 6 or 7 days after giving birth. And it's like,
Wow.
they bring the baby with them and it's like, we're not doing any internal work. I'm looking at how you're breathing. I'm looking at
Right.
how things are coordinating. We're going to get you moving sooner, but it's like, it's building all of that because if you're going to be moving anyway, you may as well be working on all of these other things.
Yeah. Well, and I remember my therapist told me things I could do in the car. Like she had like the Kegel exercises, like
Yeah.
I would have my little sheet and I would set my timer and I would do them in the car. And I'm like, okay, if I can just remind myself to do this every day, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to, work on this stuff. And yeah, it's just crazy the misinformation out there. And I so appreciate what you're doing. Well, Dr. Caitlin, where can people learn more about you and all of the amazing work you're doing and like the educational pieces that you have?
Yeah. I have an Instagram. It's Dr. Caitlin Vela, just DrCaitlin Vela. And people can go there. I also have another Instagram that I put specifically pelvic floor content on. That's Move Pelvic PT. But I don't post on that one as much. But I mean, you can go down a rabbit hole of months and months of content where we're talking about all of those things. So I would just recommend those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know that our listeners are going to get incredible value from this episode. It was so great. And I think we just scratched the surface on pelvic floor PT. So we might need to have you on again and talk about even some more tactical stuff that our listeners can do at home
Yeah.
and in the gym. So this was great.
Absolutely. This was fun. Thank you so
Yes.
much for having me. I had a blast.
Of course, of course. And thank you for our listeners for tuning in. Please make sure to check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube and share this episode with all of your friends. Until next time, thanks so much.